G'day, welcome to the Financial Bloke Podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. Wealth can be very hard to create and it often takes generations to build, and that's especially true in the business of farming. Often this wealth was built from the blood, sweat and tears of parents or grandparents, and with that should come a great responsibility to grow the wealth for your kids and grandkids, or at least preserve it. However, my experience has suggested to me that in many ways growing wealth is far easier than maintaining it, especially across the generations. That's where the old saying comes from. It takes 2 generations to build it and 1 to destroy it. The time when family intergenerational wealth and family relationships are at the most vulnerable is when you die. Having your estate planning in order is paramount if you want the wealth you pass on to have the best chance of being sustained, as well as family relationships remaining strong and intact. That's why one of the easiest way to destroy family wealth and family relationships, as well as to make lawyers rich, is for the beneficiaries having a bloody big legal dust-up over the estate. You think your family won't be like that, but I once heard a lawyer say, nothing causes family members to act irrationally more than when mum or dad dies and there's money involved. So this is where we bring in our guest, Kylie Wilson. Kylie's a lawyer and a bloody good one in my experience. She's helped a lot of my clients over the years, so I have a personal experience in working with Kylie in both the estate planning and succession planning space. She's a partner at Holding Redlich with offices in Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, Brisbane and Cairns. Kylie's a really sought after keynote speaker and is technically exceptional in the area of estates, tax, succession and also self-managed super funds. She's one of those rare professionals who also cares about her clients. One area that Kylie's expertise is demanded is by other lawyers who are dealing with complex estate planning litigations where the families got into a dust-up when mum and dad died. She's brought in to find solutions to problems or to help structure a technical defence when the estate turns into an all-out brawl. Kylie has a unique perspective on why estates turn into dust-ups and how to avoid them and preserve the family's wealth and relationships, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. For the younger listeners out there, and remember I'm 44, so anyone younger than me is younger, if you think you're not too interested in estate planning, after listening to Kylie today, you'll get to understand why you should be very interested in how your parents' estate planning is put in place, as it will impact you, especially if you're in business, just in general, or if you're in the business of farming. Now, to keep the lawyers happy, we always need a disclaimer, so I'll start with that now. The information contained in this podcast is general in nature and for educational purposes only. It's not financial advice, it's not legal advice. No one should act on the information without appropriate specific advice for your particular circumstances. I'm a former financial advisor, but no longer licensed and cannot and will not give you specific personal advice in this podcast. Now that that's all done, let's get cracking. Welcome, Kylie.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here.
My pleasure. Now, Kylie, we've known each other for quite a period of time professionally, and in my experience, your reputation as an expert is absolutely justified. Can you just start with a bit of a quick summary of your background and the area of specialisation or expertise that you're known for?
Sure. So, as you know, I lead the private client and agribusiness team at Holding Redlich, which, as you said, is a national law firm. We've got offices in Brisbane, Cairns, Melbourne, Sydney and Canberra. So relatively large firm, but my focus area is family business with a particular focus on primary producers. And I've been helping in this area for, let's say, roughly 25 years, which dates me a little. But my team has a focus. So we kind of work on the basis of having this aim of securing intergenerational wealth and providing solutions for problem family dynamics. So that means that I work in areas that include succession, which is comprised of things like estate planning, estate administration and estate litigation. Also structuring and associated tax issues, trust and death benefit disputes, which when we start getting into discretionary trusts and self-managed superannuation funds is becoming just a growing area of problem, as if there weren't enough problems already. And then other areas of agribusiness that you'll see fairly frequently, like acting for landholders in respect of mining and gas issues, acting for growers in contract disputes. So it's a fairly broad range of matters that my team focuses on, but family business really is where we've been trying to make a bit of a difference. Mainly, I think, because over so many years, I've seen a lot of problems in families that really could have been avoided with the right advice earlier on, and there's really nothing worse than families falling apart and not speaking to each other again, largely because of, for want of a better way of putting it, paying lawyers too much money.
And not being prepared. I think that's the ultimate thing is family business, or whether it be a tyre business or a farming agricultural business, the problems are still the same, aren't they? And I think, listening to you there talk about all those legal words like estate planning, estate litigation, structuring, taxation issues, most family businesses are complex. And you might think if you're on a farm or in a business that, it's not that complicated. It is when it comes to estate planning and making sure you don't get tripped up. So I think a good point to start there, Kylie, is I know what estate planning means. You know what estate planning means, but not everyone really does. So would you like to just really in a nutshell tell me what estate planning actually means?
So basically, and what I like to say to clients about this is, you shouldn't really be thinking about estate planning as I'm going to die, because people avoid it for that reason. No one wants to talk about death. It happens to all of us. I work in the area of death and taxes, so it's something no one can avoid, so it's just what we see. But what they really should be focusing on is long-term financial planning for their family. And particularly in family business, one of the big issues that comes up all the time is that there is no business in this country that thinks it's a good idea to plan the future of the business and what will happen on the death of a key stakeholder in that business in a will. And the reason for that is because it's not good business to do that. So estate planning generally, particularly in family business, can be an intersecting of issues that aren't just the will and enduring power of attorney, and shouldn't just be the will and enduring power of attorney, but should encompass an overall holistic approach to what's the business, what's the family, how is it all working together, what's the long-term plan for how this business will grow and how it might transition to the next generation, and who are the advisors, because they should all be working as a team to work together to assist this business and assist the family and make these things move forward well and with appropriate communication to avoid disputes down the track.
And I think most people that I've come across think estate planning is I have a will and therefore my plan's done. And it's a very static thing, as in I've got a will, I leave a third to each of my 3 children, and when I die, that's it. Yeah. But it's not that, is it? It's what you've touched on there, which is it's not just planning for your death, it's planning leading up to and what things do we need to do to make sure we move the chess pieces in the right direction so that not only do your wishes happen.
And with the least amount of friction as possible too. So I often hear parents talking about treating their children equally, and morally that seems like an even-handed thing to do. But particularly in family business, it often isn't a fair or equitable thing to do depending on people's circumstances. And in situations with a business, for example, which we see frequently, and particularly in farming families, where one child might have come back to the farm after school and invested their entire future in the farm, whereas there might be other children off farm who've gone on to be an architect or an accountant or a lawyer or what have you, and they're financially secure without needing to rely on the farm. So if the farm's the main asset, is it really fair to have the child whose whole future is invested in it left without a business to run if it's split equally between siblings? It needs to take an approach of looking at the business as a business, making sure that there's communication about what the expectations are, because we see frequently children will tell parents what they think parents want to hear, and parents will generally try and do whatever they think is in their children's best interests, and the two things don't always meet in the middle. And the communication has actually failed because no one's appropriately communicating about what it is that they want. And that might be, in this area of we'll just go and do a will. Has mum, for example, thought about what she wants to do personally in retirement? Has she and dad then got together and thought about what they want to do as a couple in retirement? Has the next generation thought about what they actually want for their future specifically and individually? And then has the whole family thought about how that fits in a picture to what everyone wants? That's rarely done, or at least in my experience, rarely done well. And I think that focus of that stage approach of what everybody wants and then communicating it, and sometimes that requires some help to communicate it appropriately, gets a better idea. Whereas, as you've said, you see a lot of people go, well, it's all right, I've covered it, I've catered for it, in my will. But the reality is we're seeing a massive rise in estate litigation, particularly in this area and particularly with primary producers. And the reason for that fundamentally is that historically primary production land has been held in personal names. There's a lot of reasons for that. Part of that's taxation, part of that is history. But if it's in your personal name, it becomes part of your estate and is therefore dealt with in the will. If it's in the will, it's available for what we call an estate challenge, so an application against the assets of the estate. And in circumstances where the estate is what's called a large estate, and realistically in court, that generally is regarded as anything over $1 million. And as you know well, $1 million primary production piece of land is probably pretty small.
Well, even a residential piece of land
these
now,
days, and particularly after COVID and property rises. And the problem becomes that there's been a real growth of no win, no fee lawyers in this area. Where you have that large value estate, if someone challenges what you've set out in your will, even if the applicant loses, generally the estate pays the costs of both the estate and the applicant. So the only people who win in that outcome, if it gets all the way to trial, are frankly the lawyers.
And there's no risk for the lawyers because they get paid whatever the outcome is.
Their costs will be covered. So those no win, no fee lawyers will only run these type of cases where they know their costs are going to be covered because they're running a business and they need to know their costs are going to be covered. So where you've got a high value estate, they're going to bring that application, generally speaking, without charging the applicant anything until the end because they know their costs will be covered. So there's no cost leverage position against the applicant. So you're not in a situation which you might see frequently in commercial litigation where someone's going to get litigation fatigue or, end the litigation, mediate and compromise appropriately because it's hurting their hip pocket. Where we have estate litigation and we've got applicants claiming against the estate, it's generally not hurting the hip pocket. It might be really emotional, and that might lead to the ability to compromise in a mediation. But that leverage point of things are getting expensive, that applicant won't necessarily be feeling that and probably isn't going to feel the pain because it's the estate who's going to feel the pain.
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode. And it's interesting, Kylie, I saw an example of this about 5 years ago where there was an estate disagreement and there was 2 lawyers involved. This was down south and one of the lawyers was, a really ethical guy. And I think it went through the whole process and I think they came out with a bill at the end of about $30,000 against the estate.
Yep. The
lawyer on the other side who was really pushing, the litigation and let's go to court and you deserve more. And it was really easy to whip their client into a frenzy about what you deserve from this estate. And they did exactly the same amount of work. One bill was $30,000, the other was $180,000.
Yep.
And so there's just this trough of money if you don't set it up properly, where if you get the wrong lawyers involved, as you said, potentially no win, no fee, well, then you're going to end up with everyone other than the lawyers do very, very badly.
And it can also be if you've got a personality that's entrenched. So people have to be really aware of things that are from a personal perspective, personality perspective, family history perspective, something that might have been a really minor issue when kids were teenagers or even when kids are in their early 20s, over a 20 or 30 year period can become almost fermented in the brain. You know what I mean? So it goes from being this small issue to something that's triggered a long-term resentment between people. And I've seen historically over time what happens and why clients need to be so aware of it is you might think that someone that you're providing for in the will is a really reasonable person. They'll understand what you've done and why. You can do a memorandum of wishes that sits with your will that explains what you've done and you think everyone's happy with it. But you have this problem with the way chemicals in the brain work, and we see it in a number of areas. One's grief, one's divorce, financial disaster, those type of things where the amygdala kind of floods the frontal lobe and commercial logic goes out the window. And where you have those sort of entrenched issues and someone's operating completely on emotion and resentment, it's very, very hard to negotiate a commercial compromise. So trying to settle some sort of dispute in that situation can be quite difficult and quite expensive. And then if you add to the fact, I mean, I've got one matter where we've had stepchildren where I know for a fact that they've gone to a very good law firm on the other side who's effectively told them that they don't have a case. So they've shopped around until they've found a lawyer who will run it. They've had a couple of cost orders against them in court already, but that entrenchment has been there for 25 years.
It's that resentment that's built that's maybe not been spoken at around the kitchen table.
Yeah, so they'll keep pushing that. And as I often say to clients, one of the things you've got to be aware of is that anyone can sue you. You're still stuck with the cost of defending it. The better you can communicate, the better you can identify that there might be issues in the family that need to be resolved during lifetime, the less prospect you have of your assets that you've put huge amounts of years and effort into being owned by lawyers. Because that's what you're looking at in this situation. You know, you might have a really good business, you've had children in the business that have helped grow the business, everything's moved on fine, but you've never really looked at the next stage. You've never planned what's going to happen, how the business is going to be maintained, who's going to make what decisions, how control is going to operate, etc. And if that all goes up in smoke, there's a really good chance that the business won't be viable at the end of it.
Mm. And everything you've worked for, and probably in the farming space especially, intergenerationally, it might have been, you know, grandpa or great-grandpa in a lot of cases of work to build, and next thing it's gone.
Well, then there's a legacy there. You know, there's a legacy that might, you know, not move forward. And that's not to say that these things aren't often done well. They are. I mean, I've seen some brilliant plans that have been put in place over 20 years that have worked really well, but it's the planning. You know, it's looking at it long term. It's thinking about the financial future of the family. It's realizing that if you have one child in the business and two children outside the business and all your assets are in personal names and you're only doing it in a will, even if they all get on, do all their spouses get on? You know, your prospect of dispute in those situations, if it's just a will, is probably quite high. And I can give you a good example of one I had in New South Wales a couple of years ago, because New South Wales is one of the largest estate litigation jurisdictions in Australia because they have what's called a notional estate concept. So that means that if you don't look at what's in your estate, structure things differently, plan for it, etc., before 3 years from the date of death, so 3 years prior to the date of death, a lot of it can be dragged back in. So if you have assets in a trust or assets in super, etc., it can be dragged back into the estate. But we don't have that in Queensland, but it is in New South Wales.
So what you're saying is that if you thought you were getting close towards the end of your life, and you decide to say transfer some assets and say, okay, well, for example, dad's going into a nursing home, we should start to transfer some assets, and he dies within three years of that transfer, then in places like New South Wales, they can actually claw that asset back into the estate and then it can be challenged.
If it hasn't been done properly prior, So it's even more important to plan and plan ahead. And this one in New South Wales really wasn't planned, and it was a situation where it was beef cattle. Mum and dad had the main property. Dad had bought 3 properties and owned as tenants in common with each of his 3 children. So tenants in common means that you own divisible shares. So the children owned a half share of the respective properties and dad owned the other half share. Dad's in hospital basically seeing elephants crawl up the wall 2 weeks before he died, when a local advisor goes in and redoes his will with mum, and the will changes so that the children only receive their properties if they pay out all of the debt, and they have to pay mum an annuity of $90,000 a year. And if any one of those 3 children don't meet those conditions, all of their bequests fail. for
Wow.
all three children.
Mm.
And in the daughter's case, in this, who was receiving the smallest property, mum was only 62. So if you look at a $90,000 annuity over however many years, daughter would have ended up with, arguably a negative bequest. So this had everything in it. It had capacity, it had construction, it had rectification, and you ended up with the estate, who was defending the claims, 4 family provision applications, because mum claimed and every child threw their hat in the ring. So that's 5 lawyers, 5 barristers, a forensic accountant, because of the history of the business and the funds, and a couple of valuers.
Ching ching.
Not pretty. And look, it settled at mediation, thank goodness. But if that had gone to trial, because of all those issues sitting in it, the cost would have been astronomical. And the reality was that, there might not have been much left of the pot at the end of the day. And that just came from a really unplanned, not well thought out, not particularly well drafted will. So Dad might have only paid, or in this case, Mum might have only paid, I don't know, $500 for the will. But you're talking well into 6 figures and probably 7 figures with all the people fighting about it for the sake of having put a little bit more planning and investment into structuring it right and communicating with the family and making the whole thing work.
Yeah. And that's the big issue for families is I think, Kylie, is most people don't think about putting personal insurance, like life insurance, in place until they have a health event or a family member dies. And they think, oh, gee, we better rush and do that. And it's the same with estate planning. You see it all the time where people get ill or, like you said, get put in hospital with something wrong, and they think, oh, we've got to fix the will, we've got to review the will, we've got to change things. And then it becomes a rush job, and you end up getting the first person that can look at the estate, and you end up with a massive, what I like to always call unintended consequences, which I think is probably the key to all this. It's you don't know what you don't know. And so if you've got professional advisors that aren't experienced or don't know the problems that can happen, well, then you're exposing yourself to a whole heap of unintended consequences. And you're not just controlling the legal side of things, so the legislation, you're also got how are people going to act? Like you said, spouses. I mean, I think in families, people severely underestimate the influence of spouses in these sorts of scenarios once mum or dad have passed away. And I think it becomes a lot of unintended consequences. And I think that's where I know you and I talked just before Christmas about how that a big chunk of what you do is actually other professionals coming to you, other lawyers, and saying, Kylie, we've got this estate litigation happening. There's a dust up happened. How do we fix this? Or what can we do to basically unravel this so it doesn't become just the lawyers make everything?
Or to try and make it stop. Yeah. And it's frequently because there's too much complexity in there. And a saying that you and I have talked about before, which is I think something clients need to be aware of, is would you ask your GP to remove your brain tumour? It's a good analogy. So in some of these areas where we have assets, a business, the business might not be run by individuals. There might be a corporate trustee of a discretionary trust, or it might be a partnership of mum and dad and multiple children, or it might be a company structure. And then the question is, who owns the shares in the company? How is that structured? Where does that end up on control? Who's the appointor under the trust deed? All of these things intersect. And sometimes a lot of the things that I get referred from a dispute perspective are because the dispute's already happening and it's too late to fix it. So the issue is, how do we get these people to the table to get it settled as quickly as possible? And where I've got one at the moment where I'm quite sure it's my client who's the issue, the entrenched personality. And what I tend to say to people in that scenario about trying to get it settled is what I said before. At the end of the day, do you want your assets to be owned by lawyers? You need to really focus on what this is going to cost, because you still resent something someone did 25 years ago. So it's important from the perspective of looking at resolving an issue, making sure everything's dealt with in any dispute that's already arisen. So where you talk about, I'm often getting referred things that are quite complex, it's because, for example, something's happened 6 years ago. The business was run in a partnership. No one thought about the fact that when Dad died, there's no partnership agreement. The partnership ceased on death. And they continued to try and run the business while everyone argued about the land. But no one's dealt with the partnership. And then you've got to look at the partnership dissolution, for example, because it should have ended 6 years ago.
And what's the tax implications?
Exactly. And it's all well and good to then try and settle what's happening with the land. But if you haven't thought about the partnership, what are the other partners who are in that partnership on the hook for, if that's only business assets and not the land? So making sure if there's any sort of dispute in a family business, if you're getting to a resolution, making sure that everything's dealt with, because otherwise what happens is you get a partial resolution and then people realise a few months down the track that something wasn't, and you got a whole nother dispute.
So becoming one large dispute about multiple problems that you can come together and come to a solution, you're continually going back and refighting the old battles, aren't you?
Try and just tie it all in. If a family's fighting, because one of the things is, the thing that gets my team out of bed in the morning is trying to make sure that families stay together. Or if it's already reached that point, how do we resolve it as quickly and cost effectively as possible so there's some prospect of them being able to communicate again?
So how do you do that, Kylie? So obviously that's complex. There's multiple things involved, but if someone finds themselves in the position, like that, where all of a sudden it does turn into a dust up, there's lawyers involved, it starts to get a bit messy, what should people do?
It's getting in front of it as fast as possible. It's being very conscious of not inflaming things unnecessarily. It's being careful about who's acting for you. So making sure that you're not getting advice that inflames the litigation, as opposed to, because look, at the end of the day, there are still a lot of commercial litigators out there who will act in this area, and they might have been trained to be very adversarial. That's the nature of litigation frequently. But if you've got a couple of adversarial lawyers, that case in New South Wales I told you about, we had a telephone conference prior to the mediation. There were a couple of litigation and lawyers in Sydney on the phone, and they were literally at each other about a whole bunch of issues, but presenting the perception of their client and taking that on. And I had to say to them at the end of the day, look, we've got a mediation next week, and can we just all remember that we're dealing with a family? And it would be really nice if they could still talk to each other, even if it takes a while, at the other end of this. And there are some really, really good estates litigation lawyers out there who have a very good collaborative approach to, yes, we've got to act in our client's best interests, but it's also our client's best interest to try and get it resolved for in the most cost-effective fashion possible if it's already happened. What's better, and what I prefer to see, is getting the advice, getting the communication happening, making it all work prior to it reaching that point. Because once it's reached that point and someone's made an application, you're in the court process. And it doesn't matter what anyone does to try and resolve it as quickly as possible, it's going to be expensive.
Yeah. And also, too, once you're in court, people get riled up and usually act a little bit less irrationally. It's funny, my wife's much smarter than I am, which I'm sure is for most guys out there. And I remember she said to me years ago when we were having a small disagreement over something, she said, Ben, do you want to be right or happy? And my instant reaction was, I want to be right.
Yeah.
And then by the time I went away to have a think about it, because I'm stubborn and so she, and you haven't even met my child, who's the combination of the both of us, but she was right. And I think that's the way you've got to look at things when going into these sorts of disagreements is it's nice to be right, but it's not going to give you the objective you want. I feel like you've got to sit back and go, what do I want to get out of this? And if someone on the other side is niggling at me and doing the wrong things, if the result is to get it's fixed as quick as possible, sometimes you just got to suck it up and just take it on the chin and water off a duck's back, if that makes sense, as much as you possibly can, and not be so easily offended.
Yeah. And even then, when we come back again, and I'll say it again and again and again, because I think it's key, that communication piece, because I get a lot of people contact me more because they can't get that communication going. Someone's just sitting on their hands. It's too hard to deal with. Don't want to talk about it. I've seen a lot of, and it's absolutely heart-wrenching, I've seen a lot of grandchildren used as leverage, but that may not happen in circumstances where the communications happened earlier. There's been some education around it. People have thought about how they can gain more knowledge. And in that respect, I'll give a bit of a plug to, there's an e-booklet that's coming out soon that Queensland Farmers Federation has done with the support of the Queensland government. And there's a number of advisors, including me, who've put a lot of volunteers hours into this. And it's focused on the financial security of rural businesswomen and some points and tips on that. But obviously within that is a lot of this talk around how to communicate, how to make sure you have financial security, what some of these issues are in respect of things like structures, wills, those type of things. So, keep an eye out for that coming out. It's in its final stages at the moment. I think it's going to be released in the next month or so. And that'll be just a nice, easy to read desktop thing with some pointers on some of the things in this area and some questions to ask to get conversations going. But I think that trying to, and it's not easy when you're dealing with family, been there and done it myself, but trying to reduce the emotion in this area as much as possible to keep people focused on what do we want at the end of the day here? Do we want to stay together as a family? Do we want the business to stay viable? Do we want our legacy to continue into the next generation? All of those type of questions should be being asked relatively early in the business process. So planning for what you're going to need to retire on if you're in a family business well before you need to retire, so you don't have to rely on the business. Those type of issues are so important, but often people don't know how to take the first step or don't know how to get someone else to take the first step. And really that might more be about what's the right questions to ask, what's the right buttons to push to say, if it's dad who's entrenched, understand that this is your business and you've put all the effort into it, and but don't you want that business to survive?
Nothing tarnishes, and I try and remind older blokes, shall I say, that have worked their guts out and built the farm or the business up. And I say nothing will tarnish the hell out of your legacy than if you leave a shit fight for your family to fix when you die. And
Yep.
I see it time and time again. It's more likely to be the older bloke that leaves the mess because it becomes too hard. And most men want to leave a legacy. I mean, that's an ultimate driver for most of the patriarch, shall we say, in the families, to leave a legacy and to be remembered well. And, if you drop off the earth and then all of a sudden everyone starts fighting and they say, oh, I wish dad and mum had put a decent will in place or whatever it might be, that'll tarnish your reputation really, really quickly. And the memories of you will not be great.
And particularly if dad's just sort of avoided the issue and not spent a lot of money, but also, done something cheaply that's not structured well, like the thing I talked about in New South Wales where everything just went to disaster because of a drafting issue, fundamentally. But if you have an advisor saying just do it in your will, you need to ask why. Because the question or the issue I mentioned before, if that will is going to have large assets in there, and that includes a family business, and you've only got one child in the business and a couple outside of the business, and you're just doing it in a will, the prospects of a dispute are pretty good. Just because of this, the no win, no fee lawyer problem. It's a lot of assets. Someone will whisper in someone else's ear, you should be getting a lot more of that. That farm's worth 10 mil. What do you mean you're only getting 250,000? And that's where this comes from in a lot of circumstances. So, and the other one that pops up a lot that I see is mum and dad not wanting to look at a transition of the business during lifetime because of fear of divorce in the next generation.
Which is a real fear and a real risk, isn't it?
Yeah, and it is a risk, but it's not an insurmountable risk. So there are a lot of things, if documented properly, that can be done to make sure that if that happens, there's still some security for mum and dad and the family. It shouldn't hold up a transition during lifetime, particularly in circumstances where there may be a challenge against the estate, because I can guarantee you the challenge against the estate is probably going to be more expensive than the divorce. And as I say, we can look at that and provide some solutions and put some planning in place. And again, it's about communication too, because if you're afraid of divorce in the next generation and you've got, whether it's son or daughter, it's irrelevant, but let's say it's son who's been working in the business and daughter-in-law who's not necessarily farming orientated perhaps, but she's got 3 little kids, no assets, no security of income, and no guarantee, you're probably going to create the very problem you're afraid of. Because if you've got a spouse who's really worried about the future of their children and can't get any movement or leverage on trying to get that security, that's going to create some real issues for that marriage. So that's another area where don't just say it's a problem and we don't want to deal with it. We're not going to move anything because this might happen, because yes, realistically it may happen. It's a very high percentage. Look at what can be put in place to plan it, to provide some security, to look at the business as a business, to start looking at how these things can transition and evolve and grow without stagnating them because of fears of things that actually probably wouldn't be a fear at all if you had the right advice.
And I think that reminds me of something I heard many years ago, which is what you fear, you create. And you see that quite often in families, in the sense that, they might be worried about that potential divorce of the daughter or the son. And like you said, it ends up creating environment to help facilitate that, shall we say. It may not be the reason. So, Kylie, if we could duck off a little bit and say, okay, well, once you're in a dust up, you've got to be ahead of it. You've got to get good advice. You need to make sure you've got lawyers that want to get a quick resolution. You want to get a resolution before it goes to court, all those sorts of things. And I always say a good thing is if a lawyer says to you, you deserve, or you're, straight away, you should start to have your ears prick up, because planning's not just about when you die, it's the leading up to. So how can families get, let's just say mum and dad or themselves, what can they do early, shall we say, in the scenario to actually avoid it getting to the legal dust up at the end?
So do you mean early in the business piece, or early if the dispute's already happened? Because there's two different...
No, I mean early in the business piece. So let's say, for example, using my mum and dad, for example, dad's in his early 70s, mum's in her late 60s. Statistically, they've got a number of years left under the belt. But if they left it to 2 years before they died, they'd be much better to do something about it now and plan. So what can families do to do that, Kylie? Because what I've experienced as a financial advisor over the years is the vast majority of people don't do estate planning because it gets too hard. We've got to have tough discussions, etc.
Well, and they don't look at it as a staged thing. There is no such thing as a stagnant succession plan, because it deals with the long-term planning for the family and the financial future of the family, etc. It shouldn't be stagnant. It's not a one-off, do it, set and forget. Particularly in rural family business. I mean, you've heard me talk in the past, because I do carry on about it a bit. There's 2 golden rules, and the very first one is, can parents retire comfortably without relying on the farm? Golden rule number 1. And in 80% of, first clients who come to me that I see, no one's got any financial advice on what it's going to cost for parents to retire without relying on the farm. And immediately you've got a problem, because if you don't know what that cost is, and then you look at the next stage of the second golden rule, which is, once you know the cost of that one, will the children who are taking it over have a viable business? Because if you don't have both of those, there isn't much point. And if you don't know the cost of number 1, and you don't know whether there's any capital gains tax issues in things that you're moving over, and then you need to add if there's any debt that the next generation needs to take over, that whole cost analysis has to be done early. The earlier you plan for what you're going to need to retire on, and that's not me. So most of the clients I'm seeing, I'm sending away because they actually need to get financial advice, which is not what I advise on what's that dollar figure. If we want to retire to a unit on the Gold Coast, if we want to stay in a house on the farm, but it's going to have to be a different house, if we want to travel, if we want a caravan, it's really simple. And this is where I come back to that point of, have you had the discussion about what you want first? Because if you don't know what you want is going to cost, you don't know if you can actually move that business on. And at the end of the day, if you've put, we all know what primary production is. It's 7 days a week, 24 hours a day for 1.5–2% return. It's not an easy life, but you've put your heart and soul into that farm. Do you really want that farm to disappear? And if you don't know what it's going to cost for you to retire early enough to plan and save and prepare for that, and look at things like superannuation, because it's still, regardless of the changes that the government does, the most concessionally taxed environment in retirement. Look at off-farm assets, look at how you're going to plan for that. I've got clients, and you and I have had some mutual clients we've gone through this education process with, who've been young enough, who've had children in their, under 10 or in their teens, where they've been starting to plan in their late 30s and early 40s for what they're going to have to do off farm to be able to transition to that next generation, because they're getting that education piece early enough. So the earlier you can get in front of that and work out how it's going to happen, how you can structure it, where are the financial problems, where are the tax problems, how can we plan for those? Capital gains tax is another important issue, because getting the right advice on that is really important. If it's not what we call a pre-CGT asset, which is something that's owned prior to September 85, how long's it been owned? Do the small business CGT concessions come into factoring how that can be transitioned? Do we have a cost? Do we not have a cost? If we're going to have a cost down the track, can we plan for that? Can we look at the concessions and plan to be able to utilise them down the track and structure appropriately to ensure that those things are available? That type of advice early on as possible, involves a team. So that's your financial planner, your accountant, and your lawyer. So if you have one advisor who's telling you that they can do everything, they're going to miss something, because it doesn't matter how specialised someone is, there is no one advisor in one area in these type of family businesses that can actually cover everything without missing something. So the importance of working together as a team.
For sure.
Yeah.
And one of the things, Kylie, is I always find as an example is with accountants. So accountants' modus operandi, or the goal of an accountant generally, is to help manage tax. That's, now I know a lot of accountants will listen and say, no, that's not all we do. And I agree with that. But that's essentially what they usually set up a lot of structures as, for asset protection and to manage tax. And of course, estate planning is, your structures and your entities like companies or trusts or partnerships aren't necessarily set up from an estate planning or a transitional point of view. They can be set up
or run from that perspective either. So and there can be some real historical issues that sit in these things. So let's take as a simple example a discretionary trust. So a discretionary trust it's the trustee is the legal entity, but the trust itself, it's a separate legal entity. So it's not your assets. Those assets are in that trust, and that trust can go for, at the moment, until legislation changes, about 80 years. Over time, what happens frequently in these trusts is that accountants, for taxation purposes and a whole range of reasons that they have no choice but to do, because either they're instructed to do so or someone's already done something in the bank accounts and they have to fix it, things can build up in there that actually become a real problem from a longer term succession perspective. So things like beneficiary loan accounts. What most people don't realise in trusts where beneficiaries are owed money, so a beneficiary loan account is built up, that money is payable at law on call. So if you have a change of control at some point and you thought you were leaving assets over here, but the money in the trust is owed out over here, your assets might not be ending up where you thought they were.
And it's just a paper entry, is what most people will say. Yep. It's just on paper for tax
purposes. And it's been done for tax reasons, and there are probably very good reasons to do so. And the client's been saved a lot of money for that reason. So you can't blame the accountant, because the accountant's been saving the client money. So, and that's what the accountant's instructed to do, and that's their job, and they've probably been doing it very well. But it's important to keep an eye on those sort of issues where you have a family business in particular for that longer term problem, because where you have those issues, it isn't normally a quick fix. You've got to plan how you're going to clean up that structure over a period of time, so that you're not upsetting the ATO too much.
And eroding wealth, because you have to unwind things when you don't want to, because that's normally what happens when it's a death. It's you have to unwind it, not quickly, but you're forced to unwind it. And the death may not be when someone's 90 years of age.
And it's the no choice problem. Yeah, it's the no choice problem. The same thing with partnerships, for example. So what I mentioned before about partnerships, Queensland and New South Wales are both the same in this issue. If you don't have an agreement that says otherwise, partnerships cease on death. So that means that the partners share in that partnership, if it's an individual, will form part of their estate. that might not be the intention. There might be an intention that the surviving partner, who might be different to who's getting the residue of the estate, is meant to continue that business. But if you haven't looked at it and you don't know what your agreements are, or you don't have one, or your documents aren't good enough, what you actually plan for might not happen. So you have to be really careful about understanding what you've got, understanding what sits in the financials of what you've got, understanding the documentation. And we lawyers are pretty painful because we carry on about documentation. But the reason we carry on about documentation is because without that, it's very hard to prove what people actually intended. And that's where the disputes come from. So documentation is really important.
I read something coming out of America in an estate planning book I was reading, because I'm a bit of a nerd, as you know, with all these sorts of things, Kylie. I like to know enough to be dangerous. And I'm going to misquote it, but it was something like there was some research done at a university and they'd worked out that they thought 85% of estate dust-ups or litigation could be avoided if the family had had a discussion about what was in the will before mum or dad died.
Yep, as I say, it's that communication. And I often come across parents in particular who don't want to communicate something because they know it will upset people. Well, then you're going to have a fight. like if you're worried about communicating something because you know it's going to upset someone, do it beforehand. So because you can work through that upset, you can get a facilitator in to conduct a family meeting who's got some training in neuroscience and knows how to deal with people's emotions, etc., and work through these problems. When you have the added component of the emotions from grief added to someone who was already going to be upset by what you planned, that just becomes a disaster. So, and that statistic is a very good one. The reality is that looking at these things and communicating these things as early as possible, if you don't feel that you have the skills to communicate them without a conflict, either look at getting some training on getting those skills or get someone in to help you who has those skills. Don't just avoid the problem.
Because there's people out there, isn't there?
Yep. So finding, the right person who can come in and help you with that family meeting. There's a lot of the wrong people out there too, because this is kind of a growth area and there's a lot of people who've popped up to say, I can facilitate family meetings, because frankly, there's no qualifications required for it. So look really hard into who it is that you might want to have help you. Make sure you've got some recommendations, you've talked to people, you know what their experience is and that they have a great deal of experience in it, because that experience is pretty key. But having the right person to actually help manage those conversations can really help get that next step happening without the conflict. If you avoid them altogether, and you know that someone's going to be upset about something, and as I said, and you add the grief in later, that upset is multiplied 100-fold. So the earlier you have that, and I to be fair, I've had clients who've said, well, I don't care, I won't be here. And sometimes that happens. But for the most part, people don't want to think about their children fighting it out in court, or their businesses going up in smoke while their children fight it out in court, or those sort of things. And the key to that is planning and communication.
The other thing, Kylie, I've noticed over the years as well is I saw so many files come across my desk, and we'd sit down and we go through as a financial advisor, and I'd say, okay, let's go through your estate planning. What have you got in place? How is it? And invariably, I would guess maybe 70 or 80% of people would say, oh, look, I've got this old will that I did years ago, and I've been through trying to get a new estate plan or a will and all those sorts of things in place 3 times. Or 2 times with a lawyer.
Yep.
I've gone and seen them, and then we've hit some roadblocks, and it just got all too hard, and so we put it aside. And one of the things that I really used to enjoy doing was filling that role of, people would come and we'd help them get to the point from, I want to do this, what are the roadblocks, and let's keep pushing forward. And I think that's where I've seen in the marketplace, having like a financial advisor, an accountant, a lawyer, all working together to get the result. And everyone's empowered to say, part of your job is to make sure this happens and get us to the end. And my biggest criticism of some lawyers I've seen over the years is the fact that they're technically really good. They can articulate things, but they don't follow it through. So the client hits the first road bump, which is, oh no, I don't know how to deal with my daughter who's living in Brisbane, and it might not be quite fair, so I don't know how to deal with that. Or there's some tax issues here, or we're worried about our daughter's relationship and all that sort of stuff, and they just hit a roadblock, gets too hard, they've got work to do back in the business or back on the farm, and they just shelve it. And then 12 months later, they think, we better go and have a look at it again, and they go off again. Do you find that all the time as well, Kylie?
It can be really hard because, as I said, this issue is something that people will want to deal with, but sometimes it's not an easy process. It can be really smooth, really easy process, but it's important that everything's covered. So we will often have clients who will get their first draft of something, and then we'll be following them up every couple of weeks to try and get it processed. So where you can have people like the financial planner and the accountant actually behind it, I know a couple of financial planners who will completely drive getting that finished off, because from a legal perspective, where you're the one chasing it up all the time, you need the teamwork behind you so that they've got more than one voice saying this is something that needs to be done, because otherwise they just get sick of your emails or your phone calls, or let's try and get this finished.
Or they get bogged down in technicality. Yeah. The number of times I've had people come to me and just say, Ben, I don't understand what the actual problem is. We're talking about tax and it's just got too complicated, and being able to slow it down, narrow in on what the problem is, and then say, okay, this is the problem. Don't worry about all those other problems yet. We've got to get to there. Let's just solve this little one here, and it inches us forward.
Take it in steps. Yeah. Take it in steps. And what I will often say about this type of succession planning is frequently the will is the end result. It's not the be all and end all. So there might be a whole bunch of things that need to be done to restructure how the family is structured or how the assets are structured, etc., before you even get to the point of finalising the will. We will often have an interim will in place because absolutely everyone should have a will. And the other issue there is the enduring power of attorney problem. So one of the things we're seeing a really dramatic rise in, particularly over the last 5 years, is capacity disputes.
And by capacity, you mean mental capacity. Someone's lost their ability to make decisions.
That's right. So someone doesn't have capacity anymore to make decisions, and the attorneys, they're either no attorneys, in which case everyone's trotting off to the Queensland Civil and Administration Tribunal trying to get appointed, and that's not fun, believe me. Or the enduring power of attorney hasn't been drafted well. And these things aren't print and sign documents anymore, particularly if you've got people in business together and they're the attorneys. So one of the things that often gets overlooked is this lovely section in the Powers of Attorney Act that says if you're appointed as an attorney and there's a transaction while you're appointed as attorney, even if you weren't acting as attorney, there's a presumption of undue influence and the transaction can be set aside. So knowing what you plan to have happen, understanding if you're in business with someone, the other issue is conflicts. So I had one situation where we had son and dad had been in business together for quite a long time in a partnership. Son was appointed as dad's attorney. Dad got dementia, early stages, went into aged care, had no capacity, but was likely to live probably for another 10 years just because of the nature of dementia. There was no conflict waiver in the enduring power of attorney. So because they were in business together, anything that the son did in respect of the business that benefited dad also benefited himself. That was a conflict. The bank wouldn't deal with him. He couldn't change the overdraft. He couldn't refinance. Wow. He couldn't look at any of those things because he owned everything with dad. And anything he did, even if it was in dad's best interest, was also in his own best interests, and the bank didn't want to know about it.
And that could be catastrophic.
Really can for a business. So enduring powers of attorney are crucial. These days, they're every bit as important as the will, because look at the reality. It's great that medical science has us all living longer. Hasn't quite kept up necessarily all the time with our brains. So we might be living longer, but we're seeing more and more incidences of dementia and Alzheimer's and stages of problems. We're also seeing stages of someone might arguably have capacity, but they're making decisions they wouldn't normally make that are problematic.
So almost like an inferred, it looks like they may not have capacity.
Yep. And that's emotional and difficult for the family, and particularly if they have to go into care. So, and dealing with the whole aged care process as well. It's all extremely difficult. If you have an enduring document that then also creates issues for the family business or your self-managed super fund or something like that, it's just going to exacerbate an already difficult issue for the family. And the problem is if that person has already lost capacity, we can't fix it. Not easily. So it's going to require probably a court application to try and rid, and even then, not great.
Yeah, it's leaving loopholes for lawyers to jump into to try and challenge it, and more complexities. And so we're getting close to the end of the time now, Kylie. I wanted to make one point probably that I love to use stories and analogies. And one of the things that I've always found is sometimes you'll be in a family business and you'll find some of the older generation may be a little apprehensive to do these things. For one, it can be, I don't want to talk about my death. Number two, it could be, well, I don't want to lose control. I'm not doing this. Or number three, I don't care because when I die, it's up to you guys to sort it out. But the younger generation want to get it done. And I find one of the big mistakes people make is they come in and they push really hard to try and get a resolution. And then you've got the older generation. Generally, it's dad. I'll have to say that. I know that's might be sexist in some ways, but it's generally dad. And what I try to say to people is, if you come into that situation, just imagine dad's like a cranky old bull in the yards with a bit of barbed wire around his leg. He's got to go up the crush and get that bit of barbed wire off and give him an injection of penicillin. It's the best thing for him. But if you go in the yard, start flapping your arms around, yelling and screaming and hoo-haing, he's probably going to either chase you out of the yards or he's going to jump out over the yards or hurt himself or yourself. And so sometimes it requires a little bit of pressure to be able to go, we need to get this done. We need to address this because it's a problem. And then a little bit of release to be able to go, okay, well, and later on a little bit of pressure. So it takes some finesse. And then jokingly with my mum the other day, I said, but sometimes you've got to let the cow up the race first because the bull will always follow the cow. And sometimes getting mum to go down that path first and then dad will come along as well. But it doesn't have to be this whole, we've got to get it done now. We've got to do it ASAP. It might be something like we can get something in place that's really simple and then go on a journey to be able to get us to where we need to go.
Or even discussing that first point with dad of not about the next generation's future, discuss his future. So the reality is primary production requires physical effort for the most part. Generally speaking, it does. At some point, your body's not going to let you. So get some financial advice. In the first instance, it might be an accountant, it might be a really good independent financial planner, but have a conversation with someone. Encourage dad to have a conversation with someone about what retirement looks like. Not death, what retirement looks like. So what the transition, there's this really great, and I don't have a picture here, but think of an L graph, and this is about family businesses. And there's a line at the top that is the older generation that goes like this. And there's a line at the bottom that is the younger generation that goes like this, which is all about, effort, enthusiasm, interest in the business. As you age, that goes down, and on this side, as you age, it goes up. The ideal transition point is where they cross over. In 80% of cases, the transition point's down here somewhere. That's not the ideal outcome for the business. So learning as well how to communicate some of these issues in a way that dad might hear, getting some education, finding an advisor who dad might already trust, trying to get them on side because dad already trusts them, often that might be the accountant, to talk about we want this business to stay in the family, we want this farm to stay in the family, we want things to continue. Can you help talk to dad about how his future looks, how we can make sure that he's financially secure and gets to do everything he wants, even if that includes staying on the business, how we structure that, how we agree on that, all of those sort of things. Find people to help.
Because that communication point's really interesting, isn't it? Because you've got to be able to meet people where they're at, and sometimes the people can find it all a little bit confronting because it's technical, but also they feel like they're being spoken down to, and nobody likes that.
Oh, and they can be frustrated too. There can be a long history of it's all right, I've given it to you all in my will, or it's all going to be yours one day, etc.
Yeah, that's what my dad did.
Yeah, but that isn't a guarantee. So there can be a lot of frustration for that next generation who, has friends who've had this fight already. So has seen this problem and has concerns. You have to be able to communicate. So dad also has to be able to empathise with, because if child is on farm and is planning to be on farm for the rest of their life, but has no financial security, they should know that when they're 30, because they should be able to make a decision to leave if they have no financial security, because then they're going to have their own family whose financial security is completely tied in with a farm that they may not get. So those conversations need to happen early, and they're very important, just purely from a fairness perspective.
So, Kylie, I could talk about this stuff for days, but we can't do that. So that was absolutely amazing. I know we've worked together a lot over the years, and I love what you do. You've got a world of experience and knowledge, and I've seen you take some cases where everyone's at each other's throat and not thinking practically and getting a solution. And I think that's a real skill, and I know that lights you up. That's what you love. So, yeah, I think that's fantastic. Now, Kylie, if people want to find out more about you, where can they find you online?
So you can find me online at Holding Redlich, which is www.holdingredlich.com. And I think one of the things for your listeners to remember at the end of the day is that, you've mentioned the true wealth question before. True wealth is a happy family who is financially secure. You can't ask for better than that. So getting in advance of these things, understanding where the problems lie, dealing with the issue rather than avoiding the issue, finding those advisors who will work together and help you with an approach might not be an instant solution. Be prepared to take a staged approach over a number of years, because that's what businesses have to do. It's a growth thing. So just be open to getting that advice, getting some education. You don't have to take advice if you don't like it. You can find another advisor who might give you a different option that you like better. There are a lot of good advisors out there. But it's important to take that first step to understand what you don't know. So, yep. So you can find me online. You can Google me. There's a lot of Kylie Wilsons around, but there's probably only one who comes up with agribusiness and private clients, so not too hard to find, but always happy to talk to people. Love your podcast, Ben. I think, getting this education out there is just so crucial to, stopping these disputes, getting people the assistance they need to understand the complexity and get in front of it.
Perfect. Thank you, Kylie. I really appreciate your time.
Love talking to you, Ben.
Well, that was a great podcast, and Kylie's an absolute awesome guest with a huge amount of knowledge, and I think we only just scratched the surface. So I just want to run through some points that Kylie made, because it was a really dense topic, and I think if we can summarize it down a bit of the key points, that'd be fantastic. So number one, it doesn't have to be equal to be fair. And in many cases, equal is actually unfair, especially if you leave the beneficiaries with an unviable business. The second point is you don't know what you don't know. Most things, especially estate planning, are stuffed up with what we call unintended consequences. So you need to get advice, you need to think about it and go through a process to get it right. Number three, not all professionals are created equally. Not all are technically up to scratch. Kylie gave the example about you wouldn't get your dentist to do your heart surgery. So you need to find the right people to do it and the right professionals that have got the technical knowledge you need. But they also need to be a good communicator. And what that means is they have to be able to get out of you what you actually want. And that's a real skill. They have to be able to explain the options to you in a way that you can actually understand. And again, if you don't understand, they need to be able to re-explain it a different way so you do. And the last point they need to have in the good communication side is they have to be able to explain the pros and cons of any strategy, as there are no risk-free options. It's absolutely important that you understand the pros and the cons of what you're doing. And the last point that they have to have, or last skill they have to have, is to be able to follow through. Because as Kylie said, without the right documents in place, all the planning is worthless. And I've seen a lot of professionals in my career that are bloody good at what they do, but they just never follow through when their clients get bogged down. And trust me, you will get bogged down. It always happens. In my business, I used to have a saying in the office, which my team didn't necessarily like, but it was follow up, follow up, follow up until they reply or die. So the idea is that we would always follow through to make sure the things got done that had to get done when people got bogged down. Okay, now Kylie said there was a few things for you if you find yourself in a legal dispute or a dust-up. The first thing is, remember that most of the time the estate pays all the costs. Keep that in the back of your head. And Kylie gave that example of the estate litigation that had 4 lawyers, 4 barristers, and they were expecting, if they went to court, for the legal bills to be over 7 figures or over $1 million, which is significant. And to do that, you don't need to have a huge estate. The estate might have been worth tens of millions of dollars. It might have been worth $1 million or $1.5 million. But this is what happens once it gets into a dust-up. Don't put your head in the sand. Get ahead of it ASAP and get good advice. You might have to lawyer up, but be very careful what sort of lawyer you actually engage, and make sure they're the type of lawyers that want your family to remain intact. That's really important. They're out there, but there's also a lot that don't. And you don't want someone that has the philosophy of win at all costs, because eventually what will happen is your family's going to break down and you'll end up, I laughingly say, you might end up buying them their new Ferrari. And the final point, she said, was think about the objective you want to achieve. Do you want to be happy or right? Or do you want family relationships kept intact, or do you want to win? It's really important to remember that. And when you go through a period like this, you're emotional, you're going through grief, you might be angry. It's terribly, terribly difficult, but you have to leave your emotions and your ego at the door. Even if the other side baits you, you're frustrated with them, you're angry with them. But the reality is, ignore that at your peril. You've got to keep a level head. And I remember hearing years ago a really successful person say to me, he said, Ben, he says, he or she that loses their cool first loses the argument. So you've got to keep your cool. Now, some tips to keep yourself out of a legal dispute Kylie gave. The first one is don't view your estate plan as a when you die. It should be viewed as a transition and evolving. So it needs to evolve over time. It's almost like a transition of wealth over time. The next point she said is get advice and include all your professionals. No one professional has all the answers. If your lawyer says, I can do it all, if your accountant says, I can do it all, your financial planner says, I can do it all, they're either stupid or a liar. You need to have your professionals working together because they all have skills in different areas. And you also get different opinions on different angles. And it's really important. Next point is communicate with the family before you die, or discuss with mum and dad before they die what's in the will and what they want to have happen. I gave the quote of the statistics out of the US I read a few years ago that said something along the lines of they expected 85% of all estate disputes or dust-ups could have been avoided if the family talked about what was in the will or the estate plan before the person died. Now, that's a massive, massive reduction just having the conversation. Now, I want to be really clear is it could be a tough conversation with your family, but whatever's the tough conversation, it's going to have to be had at some time. And if you need someone, and you might need someone to actually help you, you might actually need someone to come in and help you with the communication, the family with the communication, or even working through the complexities. And that might not be an accountant, a lawyer, or a financial advisor. It might be someone who's completely separate, someone like a mediator or a facilitator to be able to do that. And there's people out there that can help you. And the last point, be strong and brave for your family and address the tough decisions and the tough communication issues. It's really important that you do address those. I know it's tough and it's easier said than done, but that will make such a difference if you value your family relationships. And finally, this is a really important point from me. And I want to say this to all the blokes out there. Nothing will destroy your legacy than leaving a mess for your kids to clean up. You spent all your life raising those children. You want your family relationships to stay tough and strong as they possibly can. And at some point in your life when it comes to this, you're going to have to man up and get the job done now. So that's my advice to you is don't put your head in the sand and get it done. Now, for some people, that won't ring true. They'll want to leave it. They can deal with that when I die. And if that's your case, so be it. For those who want to keep a strong family and avoid these problems, you're going to have to address it while you're still alive. Now, I really hope you got a lot out of this podcast because, as I said, Kylie's a ripper of an expert and, we've just scratched the surface. If you want to learn more about Kylie online, you can go to the website at Holding Redlich. She's based in Brisbane, and I'll put those details in the show notes. You can join our new private Facebook group, The Financial Blokes Wealth and Wisdom. And now, again, for the lawyer's disclaimers. The information contained in this podcast is general in nature and for educational purposes only. It's not financial advice. It's not legal advice. No one should act on the information without appropriate specific advice for your particular circumstances. I'm a former financial advisor, but no longer licensed and cannot and will not give specific or personal advice in this podcast. Thanks for joining me again today, and I'll catch you with a new episode in 2 weeks' time.